Chapter 3, Part 2 of Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds by Bernard Lebouvier de Fontenelle. Translated by William Gardner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "'Tis no matter," says the Countess. "I can never suffer the inhabitants of the moon to live in perpetual darkness." "You will be more concerned for 'em," replied I, "when I tell you that one of the ancient philosophers did long since discover the moon to be the abode of the blessed souls departed out of this life, and that all their happiness consisted in hearing the harmony of the spheres, which is made by the motion of the celestial bodies. But because the philosopher pretends to know exactly all they do there, he tells you that when the moon is obscured by the shadow of the earth, they no longer hear the heavenly music, but howl like so many souls in purgatory, so that the moon, taking pity on them, makes all the haste she can to get into the light again. Methinks then, says she, we should now and then see some of the blessed souls arrive here from the moon, for certainly they are sent to us, and between the two planets some think there is sufficient provision made for the felicity of souls by their transportation into a new world. I confess indeed, says I, it would be very pleasant to see different worlds. Such a voyage, though but in imagination, is very delightful. But what would it be in effect? It would be much better certainly than to go to Japan, which at best is but crawling from one end of the world to t'other, and after all to see nothing but men. Well then, says she, let us travel over the planets as fast as we can. What should hinder us? Let us place ourselves at all the different prospects, and from thence consider the universe. But first, have we any more to see in the moon? Yes, replied I. That world is not yet entirely exhausted. You remember well that the two movements, which turn the moon on herself and about us, being equal, the one always presents to our eyes that part which the other must consequently deprive us of, and so she always wears the same face to us. We have then but one moiety of her which looks on us, and as the moon must be supposed not to turn on her own center in respect to us, that moiety which sees us always, and that fixed in the same point of the firmament. When it is night with her, and her nights are equal to 15 of our days, she at first sees but a little corner of the earth enlightened, after that a larger spot, and so almost by hourly gradations spread her light till it covers the whole face of the earth. Whereas these same changes do not appear to us to affect the moon, but from one night to another, because we lose her a long time out of our sight. I would give anything that I could possibly divine the awkward reasonings of the philosophers of their world upon our earth's appearing immovable to them, when all the other celestial bodies rise and set over their heads within the compass of 15 days. 'Tis plain they attribute this immobility to her bigness, for she is 40 times bigger than the moon, and when their poets are in the mind to extol unactive and indolent princes, I doubt not but they take care to compare their inactivity to this majestic repose of the earth. However, this opinion is attended with one difficulty. They must very sensibly perceive in the moon that our earth turns upon her own center. For instance, imagine that our Europe, Asia, and America present themselves one after another to them in little and indifferent shapes and figures, almost as we see them upon our maps. Now this sight must be a novelty to such travelers as pass from that moiety of the moon which never sees us, to that which always does. Good God, how cautious would they be of believing the relation of the first travelers who should speak of it after their return to that great country to which we are so utterly unknown. Now I fancy, says the Countess, that they make a sort of pilgrimage from one side of their country to the other, for their disquisitions into our world, and that there are certain honors and privileges assigned to such as have once in their lives had a view of our gross planet. At least, replied I, those who have had this view have had the privilege of being better lighted during their nights. The residence in the other moiety of the moon must of necessity be much less commodious in that respect. But, madam, let us continue the journey we propose to take from one planet to another, for we have now taken a pretty curious view of the moon. Coming out of the moon towards the sun, we see Venus, which puts me again in mind of St. Denis. Venus turns upon herself and round the sun as well as the moon. They likewise discover by their telescopes that Venus, like the moon, if I may speak after the same manner, is sometimes new, sometimes full, and sometimes in the wane, according to the different situations she is in respect of the earth. The moon, to all appearance, is inhabited. Why should not Venus be so too? You are so full of your whys and your wherefores, says she, interrupting me, that I fancy you are sending colonies to all the planets. You may be certain so I will, replied I, for I see no reason to the contrary. We find that all the planets are of the same nature, all obscure bodies, which receive no light but from the sun, and then send it to one another. Their motions are the same, so that hitherto they are alike. And yet if we are to believe that these vast bodies are not inhabited, I think they were made but to little purpose. Why should nature be so partial as to accept only the earth? But let who will say the contrary, I must believe the planets are peopled as well as the earth. I find, says she, you have been very well confirmed in your notions this pretty while. 'Twas but some moments since that the moon was a desert, and you were in no concern at it. And at this instant I see you would be in a violent passion if any one should presume to say that all the planets are not as well stocked with inhabitants as the earth. 'Tis true, says I. At the instant you surprised me with your objections, if you had disputed with me the inhabitants of the planets, I should not only have maintained their existence, but perhaps likewise have discoursed to you on their creation. We have our times for believing of things, and I never believed them more firmly than at that juncture. And even now, and when my senses are somewhat cooler on the matter, I can't help thinking it would be strange that the earth should be so well peopled, and the other planets not inhabited at all. For do you believe we discover, as I may say, all the inhabitants of the earth? There are as many kinds of invisible as visible creatures. We see from the elephant to the very handworm, beyond which our sight fails us, and yet counting from that minute creature, there are an infinity of lesser animals, which would be imperceptible without the aid of glasses. We see with magnifying glasses that the least drops of rainwater, vinegar, and all other liquids are full of little fishes, or serpents, which we could never have suspected there. And there is some reason to suspect that the taste which these little liquids gives proceeds from the stingings and pungency of those little animals on the tongue and palate. Now mingling certain things with any one of these liquors, and exposing them in the sun, or letting them stand and corrupt, will produce a new species of little animals. Several, even of the most solid bodies, are nothing but an immense swarm of imperceptible animals, who find for their respective motions as much room and liberty as they require. Do but consider this little leaf. Why, it is a great world, inhabited by little invisible worms of a vast extent. What mountains, what abysses are there in it! The insects of one side know no more of their fellow creatures on t'other side than you and I can tell what they are now doing at the antipodes. Does it not stand more to reason, then, that a great planet should be inhabited? In the hardest stones, for example in marble, there are an infinity of worms, which fill up the vacuums, and feed upon the substance of the stone. Fancy then millions of living creatures to subsist many years on a grain of sand, so that were the moon but one continued rock, I would sooner allow her to be gnawed by these invisible mites, than not to be inhabited. In short, everything is animated. Imagine then those animals which are yet undiscovered, and add them and those which are but lately discovered to those we have always seen. You will find the earth swarms with inhabitants, and that nature has so liberally furnished it with animals, that she is not at all concerned for our not seeing above one half of them. Why then should nature, which is fruitful to an excess here, be so very barren in the rest of the planets, as to produce no living thing in them? I must own, says the Countess, you have convinced my reason, but you have confounded my fancy, with such variety that I can't imagine how nature, which hates repetitions, should produce so many different kinds. There is no need of fancy, replied I. Do but trust your eyes, and you will easily perceive how nature diversifies in these several worlds. All human faces, in general, are of the same model, and yet the Europeans and the Africans have two particular molds, nay, commonly every family have a different form. What secret, then, has nature to shew so much variety in the single face? Our world, in respect of the universe, is but a little family, all whose faces have some resemblance. In another planet there is another family, whose faces have a different air and make. The difference, too, increases with the distance, for whoever should see an inhabitant of the moon and an inhabitant of the earth would soon perceive they were nearer neighbors than one of the earth and one of Saturn. Here, for example, we have the use of voice. In another world they speak by signs, and at a greater distance they do not speak at all. Here our reason is formed by experience. In the next world, experience contributes but little towards it, and in the next to that, old men know no more than children. Here we are troubled more with what is to come than with what is past. In the next world they are more troubled for what's past than what's to come, and farther off they are not concerned with either, which, by the way, I think is much the better. Here 'tis thought we want a sixth sense, which would teach us many things of which we are now ignorant. This sixth sense is apparently in another world, where they want one of the 5 which we enjoy. Nay, perhaps there is a much greater number of senses, but in the partition we have made of 'em with the inhabitants of the other planets, there are but 5 fall into our share, with which we are well contented, for want of being acquainted with the rest. Our sciences have bounds which the wit of man could never pass. There is a point where they fail us on a sudden. The rest is reserved for other worlds, where somewhat which we know is unknown to them. This planet enjoys the pleasures of love, but lies desolate in several places by the fury of war. In another planet they enjoy perpetual peace, yet in the midst of that peace know nothing of love, and time lies on their hands. In a word, that which nature practices here in little, in distributing her gifts among mankind, she does at large in other worlds, where she makes use of that admirable secret she has to diversify all things, and at the same time makes them equal, by compensating for the inequality. But is it not time, Madam, to be serious? How will you dispose of all these notions? Trouble not yourself, says she. Fancy is a great traveller. I already comprehend these several worlds, and form to myself their different characters and customs. Some of 'em, I assure you, are very extraordinary. I see at this moment 1,000 different figures, though I cannot well describe 'em. Oh, leave 'em, replied I, to your dreams. We shall know tomorrow whether they represent the matter faithfully, and what they have taught you in relation to the inhabitants of any of the planets. End of Chapter 3, Part 2.